Right. Okay, let's get started. Looks, keep me posted in case if I am non-audible at all. All right. All right, Looks.
Okay, Fernando. Sorry, I was muted. Yes. Okay.
Okay, great. Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us. Sorry about those technical difficulties, and I hope we'll be able to run the session within the next 45 to 1 hour. All right, so let's get started. So recently I had the opportunity to speak in the conference Asian Culture Perspectives on Psychedelics, and I thought I will introduce Buddhism and trauma-informed psychedelic integration, the connections between these beautiful two modalities. The reason is when we talk about Asian culture, it is almost very significant, the impact of Buddhism as a philosophy, as a religion that plays a role in Asian culture. And I myself come from Sri Lanka, and I have a background in Buddhism and Christianity. The reason being, my mom is a Buddhist, my dad is a Christian. And fortunately, none of my parents told me to choose a side. They were very open for us to explore all different types of religions. So I had a great influence growing up as a exploring Buddhism. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a Buddhist. So I think some of those learnings growing up influenced my practice working with helping people expand their consciousness. And then when I came across the power of psychedelic integration, I started to see direct connections between these two worlds. So I was absolutely fascinated by that. So I'm a very big promoter of recognizing the goodness in different practices in a safe environment. So moving forward, I would like to share with you that this dialogue is for in education and harm reduction purposes, and we are focusing here on healing, life enhancement, and spiritual development. And it's intended for 16 plus audiences, as some of the themes that we will discuss has a nature of maturity. All right, so moving forward, this is a self-reflective session. So I invite you to go deep within yourself and ask yourself interesting questions as we continue. All right, so we all are here because we seek transformation within our life. Now, when we talk about, when I ask you about the benefits of meditation, many of you mentioned about our mind, our body, our health, and how we are seeking development, seeking peace, seeking calmness, seeking healing. So when we talk about all of these different elements, what we are truly talking about is transformation. Now, when I started off as a professional coach long time ago, over about 16, 17 years ago, one of the things that I promised to my clientele was transformation. I was predominantly working as helping individuals transform their lives, reinvent their life. And then one of the things I recognized very quickly is that the magnitude of transformation that I was promising wasn't necessarily simply possible with the coaching conversation or therapeutic conversation. So I had to expand my practice to find ways to how to truly create or how to truly help individuals, professionals creating this transformation. So as a reflective conversation today, I invite you to think about, what does transformation mean to you? One of the interesting things that you would find out about the labels we use, the word transformation is a specific label associating a set of ideas, expectations, and meaning that we create around it. Often these labels are different from one person to other. So understanding transformation at the beginning is quite important. So the transformation is the palpable, tangible shift, change that happens in the form of an individual. It's internal, it's external, and it is spiritual as well, right? So this is the kind of transformation I intended to create, and I was looking for ways of being able to really facilitate this process. So today I'm actually very happy and very pleased with the practices that I combine, I have found out that's actually absolutely possible. And there are many different ways of doing that. And one of the ways that I do is combining Buddhist philosophy, specifically the meditation practice Vipassana, which we will discuss in a minute, neuroscience of trauma, our psychology, how our brain works and how our mind works, with integrating psychedelics. And as many of you are aware, many of you know me, I use specific plant medicine, plant sacred medicine, plant psychedelics in creating this profound transformation. Now, let's look at some of the benefits of meditation. In fact, you already mentioned many of them. Now, before we talk about the benefits of meditation, there are many different types of meditation, as you are aware. In this session today, I specifically look forward to focusing on the meditation called Vipassana. Vipassana is a form of meditation that involves observing self, observing pretty much anything, observing our thoughts, observing our emotions, sensations. Earlier, the word somatics came up, right? The bodily communication, how our nervous system is reacting to our outer and inner sensory, without making any judgment about any of these observations, rather trying to truly look at ourselves and reactions that we create in relation to who we are and into our environment without any judgment, and trying to look at them truly for its true nature rather than looking at it from our own perspectives. In other words, the colored glasses that we are wearing most of the time. All right, so we will talk about Vipassana a little bit. And before that, we will look at some of the benefits of meditation. So these benefits that I'm sharing with you are not just only limited to Vipassana. If you're doing any other type of meditation also, could create these wonderful benefits. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier is the improved emotional regulation. So we are able to reduce anxiety, depression, negative emotions, and feel a stronger emotional resilience, for an example. And another benefit is increased self-awareness. You mentioned that earlier. For an example, one of you mentioned acceptance, right? We can accept ourselves when we have a greater self-understanding about ourselves, expanding our awareness. And when we expand our awareness, we can become more mindful and we are able to live in the moment. And another benefit is mental clarity and focus. In fact, you mentioned that very clearly. And also you mentioned the word connection, right? When we have the focus and the clarity, we can strongly connect with each other because we can increase our cognitive abilities. We can focus better. We can have clear mind, and we can shut down those voices in our mind, which is like a chatter, right? Sometimes we have critics, inner critics, telling us that we are not good enough, or we should feel guilty, or we are not trying hard, and so on. So when we are able to meditate on a long term, we are able to gain mental clarity and focus so that we can build good relationships with ourselves and also people around us. And another important benefit is physical health benefits, which you also mentioned earlier. We can reduce our stress and we can relax, which you mentioned as well. So which also means we are able to regulate our body, our blood pressure, our heart rate, how to manage the pain, and increasing the supporting our immunity system, and basically improving our overall health. So these are very simple for mostly going inward benefits. If you notice, these are mostly self benefits when we engage in a meditation practice for a while. So if you are meditating, if you are a regular meditator, I invite you to recognize before you started your practice, how have you transformed yourself? What is the speed like of this improvement, gradual development within yourself, right? So like I mentioned earlier, it's always good for us to look at these things from a perspective that we can measure, that we can gauge. So one of the best ways we can do is to look at these things from science, because science is evidence-based, and specifically here we are talking about neuroscience. So everything that I will be discussing today during this session is going to be fully align with science. If you would like any specific resources to find where this information come from, you're most welcome to let me know. So let's look at the benefits of meditation from a neuroscience perspective. In other words, we are going to literally look at our brain, our nervous system, and recognize how certain parts, certain components, certain neural networks operate in our brain and our nervous system, and how they are directly related to meditation to begin with. Because what we are trying to do today is to see the psychedelic integration from a Asian perspective. So the Asian perspective specifically we are having today is the Buddhist meditation practice, which is originated in Asia, and now it has expanded all around the world, and there is enough research scientifically to prove how meditation directly impacts our brain in a positive way. So when we look at our brain, we are all aware at a very primary level, we have two special brains. One is the cortical brain, which is the cognitive brain, which helps us to think and process. And then underneath of our cerebral cortex, we have subcortical brain, which is mostly the unconscious and subconscious connections under our limbic system, which is the white color layer that you see inside of our brain. So mostly when we have from growing up as a child all the way becoming an adult, we go through a lot of experiences in life. Now, some of these experiences are positive, pleasant, and then there are also experiences that are sometimes be labeled as negative, challenging, difficult, or adversities. Apart from that, we also live in a world where we constantly receive information from your parents, from your school teachers, from your friends, from your culture, the community you live in, the society that you belong to. You often hear a lot of, or you often receive a lot of information. And all of these experiences collectively create neural networks in our brain, and that makes you who you truly are. That's why sometimes certain things you approach with cautiousness. Some things you're very open to. It's because there's an association behind your mind, your thinking, your brain, that you perceive certain things in a specific way, right? So often this is not just only, often we think like we are in control. In other words, we feel like that we are operating fully with our cerebral cortex, the cognitive brain, that we know what we are doing, we are in control. But what we are not recognizing is that often the way we behave, the way we react to certain things are actually controlled by our subcortical brain, in other words, the unconscious and the subconscious brain, because we don't necessarily have the direct control over them apart from specific practices, especially things that can be repeated many times in order for us to make a change into our subconscious or unconscious brain. So as an adult, when you are like 30 plus, often you think like you are in control, you know what you're doing, and it's in full control of your processing brain, thinking brain. The truth is that you're not. Often the conditioning, traumatic responses, traumatic experiences, challenges, adversities, positive experiences, all the belief system, the values that we have created really come from our deep mind, so that we are basically being controlled by our own mind, which we don't necessarily tangibly recognize. So this is interesting, because if we are talking about transformation, it's important that we recognize what is it that we need to truly transform in order for us to have a higher level experience, whether it is spiritual, whether it is professional development, personal development. And that's the reason why we need to look into the brain science as we explore these topics. Right, so for an example, let's look at a few areas of our brain. Now, we talked about earlier improved cognition, mental processing, increased self-awareness, and physical health benefits and emotional regulation earlier, right? Now, let's look at our brain. So for an example, if you look at the basal ganglia, which is the part of our brain which controls the executive function, often when we need to make a decision, we have to weigh between our emotions and also our thinking, and also our intuition, the energetic perspective. So it's a very interesting process in our brain. When we make a decision, all of these parts come to play a role and then help us to make a decision. And this is usually connected to many other components. Like for an example, hippocampus. Hippocampus is little like the seahorse piece that you see over here in the brain, right? So this area is responsible for forming memories, learning, and processing emotion. So when we use executive function to make a decision or to come up with our next steps based on what is happening to us, our surrounding and our internal world, we need this information particularly from different parts of our brain. So for an example, we would be using the PCC, posterior cingulate cortex, which has the details about self-reflection, integrating information about ourselves, our memories, retrieving our memories, to be very specific. So we need all of these different components coming together to play a specific role so that we can make decisions and we can operate in our day-to-day world. Now, if we start to compare these parts with the benefits of the meditation, you are starting to recognize an immediate connection between the areas of the brain and then how meditation benefit us, right? So for an example, if you talk about improved emotional regulation, now we are literally talking about several parts of our brain, right? To begin with, let's think about amygdala. Amygdala is our fight and flight response. Whenever there is a threat present in our world, in our atmosphere, our amygdala fires, immediately recognize whether this is safe for us. If not safe, if it is a threat, we need to decide whether we are going to fight it or whether we are going to run away from it, right? So we recognize that if you want to regulate our emotions, that has a direct connection to amygdala, especially if we grew up in an environment which is stress prone, growing up as a child, our amygdala has been on a regular basis fired over time, and that has become like a mantra. It has become like a repeated pattern over and over again, so that we continue to experience anxiety even in environments that we don't necessarily need to be anxious. Now, when amygdala takes all the attention, especially as developmental stages, when we grow up, sometimes because we live in a hostile environment, it may be because one of the primary caregivers are always angry, abusive, or you are emotionally neglected, or you have a parent who is abusing a specific substance, or your mother is being treated violently, or your mom is a violent person, for an example, or there's a predator or perpetrator in your environment. Someone might be humiliating you, sexually approaching you, abusing you, anything like that. So when some things like this happen, this kind of adversities happen to us as children and adolescents, the most of the blood and the focus goes into amygdala because we are on a constant fight and flight response. However, so when this happens, what happens is other parts like hippocampus for forming memories, learning, and emotion doesn't receive the right amount of attention, even to begin with the necessary amount of blood. So these areas become less functional or sometimes even dysfunctional to the level that they could reduce in size to begin with. Neurologically, it could become smaller in size because there are other priorities that we need to take care of because it threatens our survival to begin with, right? So when we have been exposed to especially adversities, traumatic experiences growing up, especially in a chronic manner, which means on a regular basis, on a long term, our brain starts to be affected neurologically, not just only psychologically. So when we start regulating these components, we are able to process our emotions better, for an example. And then if you look at mental clarity and focus, now this directly means the functions in our prefrontal cortex to begin with, right? We are able to make the right decisions. We are able to control the stress, and we are able to form sense of self strongly, and we are able to make decisions, good decisions, for an example. And then again, we looked at the PCC, right? So that is the area where we are self-aware, the sense of self. We are able to understand ourselves. We are able to clearly look at ourselves without feeling danger all the time around us. And when we go into meditation, for an example, even if we may have experienced adversities, we are able to re-regulate these specific areas of our brain, including the entire nervous system. So we are able to become more self-aware. And that's why you already mentioned that these are some of the advantages of meditation, or the benefits of meditation. And then if you look at the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, it regulates most of our somatics. For an example, our heart rate, our attention, our impulse control. Now, this is where it creates this stress reduction, the relaxation. We are able to regulate our blood pressure. We are able to regulate our heart and other parts of our body. So you're starting to now recognize that our brain has significant key components, areas as neural networks. When we continue to meditate, we are able to naturally re-regulate these areas and create these benefits of meditation. Now, moving forward, we are, of course, very aware meditation acts as a catalyst for spiritual development. Now, moving forward, we talked about Vipassana earlier, and I very briefly introduced to you what Vipassana is. Now, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into Vipassana for an example. So the word Vipassana literally in Sanskrit means observation, if not seeing. Seeing things for what it is, seeing things for true reality, seeing ourselves for true reality. And one thing that I have noticed working with individuals in their healing journeys, that the more we are able to look at ourselves, recognize ourselves, and accept the things that have happened to us, the things that we are and things that we want to become, the faster our evolution, our development and healing becomes as well. So for me, Vipassana truly is a healing modality. It's a beautiful healing modality. And it's so pure in a way. It's because it's not influenced by anyone else's opinions or anyone else's advice as such. Like, for an example, as a professional coach, one of the integral principles of coaching is that we believe all our clients, all our coaches are able to find the answers within themselves without me as a practitioner having to tell people what to do. And it is evident when we go deep within ourselves, we are able to find all the answers. So coaching is a type of Vipassana. It's kind of like a guided Vipassana. In other words, we should not get misled by Sanskrit words. We should just look at the plain meaning of it, and then we recognize that it's truly looking into ourselves, to our true nature. And that's exactly what we do in a therapeutic process or in a coaching process. Right. Now, there's an interesting thing that we need to talk about as we talk about Buddhism and especially Vipassana. Now, when we say observing ourselves, and one of the things that soon, as you continue in Vipassana long term, one of the things that you start to observe is sense of self. Who are we really? Answering the question, who are we? Now, if I ask you the question as a reflective inquiry, who are you? Now, potentially, you would say your name, right? You already did it, but probably. You will probably identify yourself with a specific practice. Now, when I told you at the beginning, introduce yourself. Well, of course, it's socially necessary. You said, I am this person, I am from this country, and I am in this specific practice or something like that, right? So you see, we are very quickly associating ourselves to external realities when we basically introduce ourselves. Like when you say when I say my name is Fernando, it really doesn't necessarily represent who I am. Fernando is a name that was given to me by my parents, and it was not a choice for me to be called Fernando. And Fernando doesn't necessarily define who I am internally. I could say I am from this specific country, I live in this specific country, and I'm doing this practice and all of that. If you notice, they are all external associations. I live in Thailand, so it's an external association. It doesn't say much about who Fernando really is, who I am really, right? Or if I said that I am this specific practitioner, it just tells me what I do for a living. It doesn't necessarily tell who I truly am, right? So the more you go into Vipassana meditation or observation of your own self, the more and more you start to realize that we have a specific sense of self, that we say, I am like this, I don't like this. I am this kind of person. I'm an extrovert, I'm an introvert. I like party, I don't like party. I like this food, I don't like this food. If you start to notice that these are all associations, the more we look into something, the more we see that they are associations. The more we see that everything that we see around ourselves are associations, the more we start asking ourselves, who am I really? So have you asked that question yourself? Have you ever asked yourself, if you remove all of these associations around you and truly look into yourself, who are you really? Without your likes and dislikes, negative thinking, positive thinking, challenges and pleasures, all of that, who are you really? So today I invite all of you to take that deep dive, if you feel comfortable, and asking yourself, who are you? And the more and more we talk about who am I, who are we, the more and more we start recognizing that we have something called sense of self. We have this kind of constructed belief of ourselves as a sense of self, and often we call this our ego. So I talk a lot about this now. I think it's important. So if we start to look at ourselves without all of these associations, what would you see? So I'm going to leave you with that, because I don't have an answer for you, because this answer is absolutely very much yours. It's absolutely up to you to find out what is your sense of self and what is beyond sense of self, or what is beyond ego. And when we talk about Buddhism, often we talk about taming ego. And I think it's understood in many different ways in Buddhism, depending on the type of religious practices, the spiritual practices, or philosophy itself. Often we are trying to tame our ego. If you're a Buddhist, if you're familiar with Buddhist philosophy, you hear this on a very regular basis. So we need to ask ourselves, so what are we really trying to tame then? If we are looking closer and closer to sense of self, or looking at our ego, and we are recognizing we are seeing associations. So I'm asking myself, and I'm inviting you to ask yourself. So if the sense of self is a construct, what are we really trying to tame here, as Buddhism suggests? Right. So interesting thing that I found out through my meditational practices is that the truth in emptiness, or in Sanskrit word again, Shunyata. Shunyata is the emptiness. If you really look at it from the Buddhism perspective, this means that everything is interconnected, intricately interconnected. In other words, we cannot make sense of anything without making an association of that specific thing with another thing, right? So there's no independent existence, for an example. So the more you look closely of independent existence, you recognize that this dependent existence or interrelated existence constantly keep changing. It's not one specific thing. It keeps changing all the time. And now tapping back into the word emptiness, if you start observing something long enough, you're starting to recognize that actually there's nothing there. Now we can even look at it from the quantum perspective. Quantum literally means the smallest possible, the tiniest possible existence. So even if you look at things at beyond a molecular level, at an energy perspective, we are recognizing that. For an example, now we know that an electron can be in two places at the same time. If not, an electron can be everywhere at the same time. So what does that really mean if you look at things at a deeper level? Or we also know that if you take a photon and separated it and bring it apart from each other for like a million light years, once we change this particle, it immediately changes the other one. So we need to ask the question, is there true distance, or is there no time? Because some information seem to have passed on based on human understanding. So like this, when you start ruminating and when you're looking deeper from the smallest possible perspective, if not quantum perspective, you're starting to recognize that there's matter and then there's antimatter, and they come and go in trillions of times in the human time that we can measure. So we are starting to ask the question, what really exists or what doesn't exist? But you even see when we say exist, it's always connected to not existing. When we say not exist, it's connected to existing. So this is the emptiness that Buddhism is talking about. And although this is just a concept in mind, I think it's very abstract to explain. However, if you go deep within yourself and if you start Vipassana, if you start observing it, then you tap into the emptiness, recognizing that the longer you look at something, that it disappears and you realize that there's nothing in there. All right. So just to bring us to a little understanding here, you're seeing just a very obvious object, which is the pencil. Now, imagine if I presented this pencil right in front of you in my hands, and if I told you, look at this pencil, look at this and explain to me what this is without a frame of reference, without a frame of reference. In other words, look at it from its true essence, or look at it for its true essence. What would you tell, right? So go inward, how would you describe it? Well, I do these things in some of my spiritual, the sessions that I do. And often some of the answers I hear is that there is a stick-like figure. Someone says something that we can use to write, or it's made out of wood. You say whatever we would say, it's a stick figure. It's something that we can use to write. It's something made out of wood. Immediately, there's the wood, there's the stick. So there are actually associations to it, immediate associations to this thing that you see in front of yourself. Now, just to change this a little bit, let's think about you were just born, like a newborn. You just came out of your mom's womb, literally. And now you are right here. And then I show you this pencil and try to ask you, what do you see? And now that is an interesting scenario, isn't it? You wouldn't be able to say what it is because you were just born, which means you don't have enough associations to recognize the pencil. You probably wouldn't even know the difference between me, my hand, the pencil, or my surrounding, anyone around me. The reason being that you haven't developed enough associations. Well, when you were born, you have enough associations to begin with because you are genetic material from your ancestors, right? From your parents, you got your DNA. Your parents got the DNA from their parents, which is your grandparents, and we have about 14 generations of DNA within ourselves. So there's information within ourselves, but our cognitive process hasn't begun in that level yet to identify something. So if you're thinking what it is to truly do Vipassana, it's almost like going back to your reborn self, like just born self, looking at things without any association, and you immediately recognize how difficult it would be. The reason being that we have learned so much about our existence. We have learned so much about ourselves, our environment, which is absolutely necessary for survival. But because of this process of learning what is out there, we are unable to almost unlearn it and look at it. So what Vipassana truly enables us in a vibrational possibility or long-term possibility is truly to shut down this learning, these associations, and truly look at ourselves and truly look at this reality that we live in. All right. So in Buddhism, we say that the highest level of meditation enables the dissolving attachment. Dissolving attachment. The word attachment here literally translates into associations that we are working with, like the pen, the pencil, the anger, the thing that you like to eat, the thing that you don't like to eat, the person you like, the person you don't like. What if you were able to shut down all these associations for a few minutes, for a few seconds? What would that mean? Now, the moment you do that, you recognize that you actually dissolve the sense of self. Actually, you remove the ego. Now, this is what often is known as astral projections or outer body experiences or near-death experiences, or sometimes psychedelic experiences or deep meditative experiences, being able to dissolve sense of self, dissolve our ego. And I think this is very strongly misunderstood by many spiritual practitioners. When we say dissolving ego, we feel we almost like disassociate ourselves from our environment. Like I have heard a story, someone saying, very high level monk who has gained a lot of spiritual knowledge and has been able to dissolve ego to an extent. When there is someone coming towards this high level spiritual practitioner with a knife and try to attack him and kill him, the spiritual practitioner would just surrender to that person, being allow that attack and allow them to die. I have no specific attachment to that, but I think that's very counterproductive. That's very counterintuitive to who we are as human beings, because that means we are not even fully aware of or we are not engaging in our survival tactics that our body has so that our consciousness can continue. So for me, the ego death or dissolving ego or dissolving attachment is not in that context of that we can't love someone, we can't have a partner, we can't have a loving sister, we can't love food, we can't love material things. I think that's a very big misconception often that we are not clearly thinking about. Because if we are to survive in this material universe, we need to be able to survive our body, survive our mind, so that our consciousness can continue. So dissolving ego doesn't necessarily mean that we just disassociate from everything and surrender to any hazard around us. Rather, it is the ability for us to get to a vibrational space in a way that we are able to disconnect ourselves from our own sense of self, our own ego, for those few seconds maybe, or for those few minutes, or maybe for those few hours, depending on the type of practice. Because once you do that, you become aware of the true nature of universe, which is actually Shunyata, which is actually emptiness. Now, once you have accessed that level of vibrational knowledge, when you come back, you are able to love without attachment. This is one of my favorite sentences. Love without attachment. It means you are able to survive. It means you are able to connect with things, you're able to process things, and you're able to love them. You are able to fear things. You're able to love. You can process pain, you can process pleasure, but you are neither attached to pain nor attached to pleasure. You experience pleasure, you experience pain, but at the same time, you recognize them for what they are, because you recognize that when we live in a universe of this nature, which is hazardous, which is which we need to navigate carefully for us to remain conscious, remain alive. It's important that we have fear, which means there is pain. When I hit my hand very strong, when I just was born, when I hit my hand, it hurt. So I knew I shouldn't hit my hand very fast. And I knew if I stepped out of this 20th floor that I'm on, I will fall down and die. So this is because I have safety mechanism as a being, as a human being. I understand hazards in life. At the same time, if the life is hazardous, we also need to see that why do we live through pain? Why is it that I don't give up all the pain that is available in the universe? It's because on the other side, there's pleasure. There is, like, for an example, if you ask a mother, what is the most pleasurable thing in the universe? They will probably say it's their children, the love for their child. So you imagine there is love, and the love is actually pleasure. We experience love as pleasure, whether it is sexual intercourse and orgasm, whether it is birth of a child, whether how you feel for your parents, whether how you feel for your children, they are all pleasure. So we live in an interesting paradoxical universe where there is one end, there is so much pain, and then on the other hand side, there is so much pleasure, so that we can find the balance between pain and the pleasure and live a life that is fulfilling, that is gratifying. And at the same time, if we attach too much to pain, that becomes attachment that becomes painful. If you attach too much yourself to pleasure, that's where the pain creeps in easily. So the ego dissolution, if not dissolving sense of self here, means for a short period of time, vibrationally being able to dissolve all of these connections and then emerge through it, recognizing that you actually can love everything. You can love pain, you can love pleasure without being attached to them, in a way that you recognize that this is only a way of processing. This is only a way of experiencing. When I experience pain, and also when you experience pleasure, you recognize that pleasure is a possibility in this material universe for me to experience. But I don't have to be bound to neither of these ends, so that I can remain free. I can remain observant fully and momentarily enjoy those things, enjoy pleasure while it's available. And I don't know whether I could say enjoy pain while it's there, but be aware of pain while the pain is present. So this is what I would like to call as ego death. Right. Now, I also mentioned that in our talk today, we will talk about the trauma. Now, have you ever heard the word healing trauma or addressing trauma in the spiritual context, in spiritual development? Now, this is another very big area that we need to bring light onto, and that's why I'm having this session today. The reason is that often we think that becoming spiritual means we are following a specific practice, or we are dressing up in a specific way, or we are wearing a specific color, and we are behaving in a specific way. And that is what brings us to spirituality. Well, that is definitely a part of it. That could definitely help us to ground ourselves to a specific practice. But at the same time, we also need to recognize when we talk about true spiritual development, it's not something that's pleasurable. If you think about spiritual journey as a sacred, always feeling good, and if I'm feeling bad, I'm not spiritual, then we are very strongly diverted. That means we are stuck between this pain and the pleasure context again. So in my way of seeing the world, and especially spirituality, it's important that we also address things that we don't like, which includes trauma, adversities that we have in life. And also now, as we continue to explore neuroscience, we will continue to recognize that when we have had adversities in our life, it actually hinders certain areas of our brain. You already saw some of the components. If these areas are already hindered or not functioning, not regulated fully, no matter how much we will chant something in a specific way, dress up in a specific way, do something in a specific way, the specific part of our brain still has that problem, that distortion. So we need to clear that distortion out. So addressing trauma through a spiritual journey, or while we are talking about spiritually developing, addressing our trauma is absolutely so important. And I think only very few people in the world who are really talking about the importance of addressing recovering from trauma, or interpreting trauma, addressing them and recovering from them, or come to terms with of them as a way of a spiritual journey, apart from all the other vibrational practices that we are doing. So let's understand trauma a little bit in a very, very simple context. Now imagine a little child being very afraid of a dog. The reason the child is afraid of the dog is because his survival is threatened when the dog approached the child. So like I said earlier, the amygdala was very, very confused, very scared, and it had to either fight or flight. Sometimes we don't necessarily do that. We just freeze. In this case, the child froze because child's brain was overloaded, didn't know what to do. The entire sensory system shut down. Now, this doesn't happen just only when a dog is barking. This happens when sometimes a person being raped, for an example. They just become, their nervous system is overloaded. They cannot, the motor control, the basal ganglia cannot make a decision what to do. The executive function is not regulated, not in a position to really make a decision. So this is a traumatic event. When there's a challenge that we face in our environment that threatened our life, it can be considered as a traumatic event. But at the same time, not everything that threatens your life is only traumatic. The there is no gauge to recognize what is traumatic, what is not. It depends on the situation, it depends on the person, it depends on the state of mind we were in, the state of somatic, state of nervous system at that moment. So there is no like less traumatic or more traumatic as such. Everything that threatens our survival in some way can be traumatic. And when this happens, we make changes to our brain, our nervous system, DNA, even at a spirit level, even at an energetic level, it changes us. Like for an example, if you're thinking, what is at spirit level changing? For an example, certain cognitive impairments or certain impairments that happen within our um, the system that I said unconscious can affect our intuition, which is our energy perception. We don't know how to operate intuitively in a specific situation. That means our spirit, that means our energy perception is affected. So traumatic events directly affect us, change our brain, body, nervous system, and our spirit, if not our energy. Now, at a later time, when this little boy as a grown adult, sees a little pet dog, goes into that same response, freezing, for an example. You can tell this person a million times, hey, it's a puppy. You don't have to worry about this puppy, and it's not going to attack you. It's not going to be dangerous. But in reality, it's not understood by the cerebral cortex. And this is what I was mentioning earlier, right? We have the outer layer of our brain, which is the thinking brain. And we can think upside down on our head. We can think, yeah, I shouldn't be afraid of a dog. But the moment the dog is there, we are going to feel that same response to a certain extent if we haven't recovered from that specific traumatic event yet. And the interesting thing is that this is an unconscious response. In other words, the person doesn't cognitively like think, oh, I should freeze now, right? That's not how it works. It's automatically we are controlled. And this is what I meant earlier. When we grow up, our brain has learned, our nervous system has learned to program us, condition us in a specific way that we behave to certain stimuli outside of us, depending on how we have processed previous experiences. And this is an unconscious response. In other words, the trauma symptoms, trauma responses are unconscious. We cannot consciously control them. And that's why they are very challenging. And that's why sometimes we tell people 100 times, you don't have to be afraid, you should be doing it, you should get your self up and go and do it. You should make that phone call, you should go for that interview, you should talk to that girl, you should approach your boss. Why are you always like this? We can say that 100 times. If there is an unconscious response within that person, it's not going to be easy for that person to change. You are lucky if someone is next to you and saying that you can do something or you should do. But the unfortunate truth about trauma responses is that sometimes we live an entire life of unconscious programming without recognizing that we are actually being affected by them. Now, if you look at some classic trauma responses, I could share with you these four: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right? Fight is when we feel anger, irritability, aggression all the time. Now, for an example, I remember one of my friends from Soviet Union who escaped during the high time of adversities in Soviet Union to Germany. And she said as a little child, she remembers her father always fighting against the Soviet thinking, Soviet mindset, and the adversities they experienced. And then after they crossed over to Germany and started living a more healthier, more safer life, his father couldn't stop fighting someone, which means he would fight at the grocery store, he would fight at the pharmacy, he would fight with the children or the mother or the family members. The reason is now that is hardwired. This unconscious response to fight is showing up all the time, so he cannot control, regardless now that new environment is safe. And then the flight response, anxiety, fear, panic. Do you have a friend who doesn't pick up your calls? Do you have a friend who didn't reply to your messages for a long time? And then you go like, oh, I did so much to this friend. See, now they don't even care for my messages. They don't even open my messages. So if you have thought like that, this could be potentially a trauma response. They may be flying away from social responsibilities. They may not be able to take actions, take responsibility for what is happening in their life, because that they feel like they need to run away from something, run away from a trigger that is present in their life. You don't need to necessarily be the trigger. Your message is not necessarily the trigger, but it may be someone yelling at them over the phone, or some person that they are afraid of is now in their contact list. It can be that. But our brain cannot necessarily separate and compartmentalize that easily certain triggers, so that we respond to triggers around us openly as unconscious response. Freeze. Now, this is what I talked about earlier. Sometimes when a woman is raped, she does nothing. She just wait there without saying anything, without doing anything, just close eyes and wait there until that whole episode finishes. And then later on, when the perpetrators talk about it, or when it was brought to a specific legal system, people would blame the person and say, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you do anything if you didn't like it? Right? So what we are not recognizing here is that the executive function shut down because of the high functioning of amygdala. They just froze, so they couldn't speak. That's the disassociation from reality. Now, disassociation can have many forms. Immobilization. For an example, if I'm on a very top of a mountain or a height without safeguarding myself, I can't even move my eyeballs, for an example, immobilization, because I'm afraid of the height. Height is my trigger, right? And then there's a trauma response showing up for whatever the reason that I cannot move. Now, this could be related to one of my ancestors. For an example, maybe one of my ancestors jumped off a cliff trying to die or trying to commit suicide. Maybe they survived. When they survived, like I said earlier, the DNA stored this information and passed it on to my mother or my dad, and then they passed it on to me, because I have never had an accident or anything like that from a height. But this could be related to my ancestral trauma. Or one of my ancestors witnessed someone jumping out of a building, for an example. They got so scared, they built this specific response to it, which can also be transferred through genetics. We call it epigenetics. And some of the other disassociation can be binge watching TV all the time, or we are addicted to our phone, just keep going, or we just disassociate from the work that we have. For an example, we call it procrastination, chronic procrastination, right? Or we isolate ourselves. So this is freeze response. And another interesting response is the lack, the anxiety that took place in our life, and the fear that we have generated as a kid or growing up as an adolescent. We are afraid if we didn't comply, we will not be accepted, we will not be validated. So that we tend to have people-pleasing tendencies. Sometimes we can't say no, we are not assertive. We end up prioritizing other people. We run around, help everyone, and we end up even sometimes feeling really good about this helping behavior of the people. But we never really stop to ask ourselves, how healthy is this people-pleasing behavior? And the chronic stage of this can even be to the level that we start self-harming ourselves. And I could share this experience with you. As a child growing up, I had very emotional, abusive environment. So now every time I would go back to my childhood memories, especially meeting my people from my childhood, I would have time, sometimes weeks of self-harming. Like what I mean by this, either drinking alcohol, or like the trauma response is so strong in me that I have to drink alcohol to kind of like numb myself, like disassociate from that reality. And by doing that, the more I engage in these associative compulsive behaviors, the more I will start harming myself. For an example, smoking. I used to smoke a lot after seeing my specific family members, and long time ago I didn't understand what that was. But as I started learning and becoming a practitioner in this space, the more and more I started to see myself and recognize every time when I go meet these specific people, I come back with this specific behavior, and I recognize that as a trauma response. So what I would like to do is invite you to think about yourself. If you have these very simple trauma, these ones are just the classic responses. We can do a PhD on trauma responses to begin with, right? So if you catch yourself in some of these areas, you can ask, where is the trigger? Is there a pattern, for an example? So these questions might help you recognize that they may be coming from a specific root cause that you might not necessarily be connecting directly. And when this happens, we call it CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. You know what PTSD means very much. And that is when you are able, when you have stress related problems, stress related disturbances in your life because they are connected to some traumatic experience. Sometimes we know directly, this happened to me as a child. As a result, I'm behaving like this. But often we don't really know why are we behaving this non-serving ways. It could be related to several trauma that may have taken place over a specific, especially long period of time. They may be a mix, and that's why we call it complex PTSD. So if you're unable to find a root cause to a specific non-serving behavior, it could mean that you are experiencing CPTSD. But please do not jump into conclusions immediately. It's important that you meet with a professional who is capable of diagnosing you and then taking the right actions. These are only for you to start thinking, start recognizing whether you need to actually approach a specific professional if you are looking for development and expansion. All right. So now we talk about earlier when traumatic experiences happen, the certain the responses, the symptoms that we show, right? So for an example, let's look at specific areas of our brain that gets affected by trauma. Amygdala. It creates the hyperactivity within ourselves. There's increased sensitivity and emotional dysregulation because the amygdala is the fear function, the fight-flight response, so that when it is strong within ourselves, and then it has happened repeated over a very long period of time, it programs itself to respond in this specific way on a regular basis, even for the peripheral environmental changes. Sometimes if you notice, like, people have this like impulse, like they are always afraid. They can't sit in one place for a while. They just get afraid for no reason. And sometimes if you touch, they get afraid. If you open the door, they get afraid. If you have noticed people, now this is a very good example of some level of amygdala being affected by specific experiences. And hippocampus, the learning, memory forming, emotional regulation part of our brain, learning about emotions part of our brain, right? So it can reduce volume literally. It can impair the memory processing. And this is why when we have had like a very turbulent, very childhood with a lot of childhood adverse experiences, we tend not to remember our memories. Well, naturally also, we forget many parts of our childhood. But if you specifically miss out specific time frame, specific memory around a specific person, this could be related to also specific trauma response. So which would also mean that your memory can be impaired, especially like imagine a child growing up in an adverse environment. There's someone who is neglecting them, or someone being abusive towards them. It can be emotional or sexual or physical. It doesn't matter. Now, because the perpetrator, the danger is always in their environment, their amygdala is acting up all the time. That means they will naturally not be able to focus on their studies. They will not be able to form right memories, so they wouldn't remember what they learn in school. And they will not be able to process emotions about themselves, about their environment, about their friends and their family even, right? So that means they are not learning properly how to regulate their emotions and recognize the right type of emotions. So that would necessarily mean that they will not be able to contextualize their environment. And often people who experience this kind of like constant threat, danger in their environment, growing up as a child or an adolescent, often find themselves not being able to study well, not being able to remember, not being able to academically perform well, not be able to regulate themselves on a regular basis. So this could mean that impairment of hippocampus. And then prefrontal cortex can be reduced activity because of the fear that is threatening us all the time. That would mean that we are not able to make the right type of decisions. We might not be able to control the impulse. And so if I talk about this, now imagine when we are in a supermarket, or when we're at a hotel reception, or when you're taking a specific transportation services, you may have noticed that one person get angry very quickly, and the other person also get very angry very quickly. And then they start kind of fighting with each other verbally to begin with, and then they might even go to the extent of fighting with each other. And then potentially both of these people will go home at night, and then they will take a sit and think that was totally uncalled for. That was totally unnecessary. I shouldn't have been angry. I should have acted more calmly. Oh, that person actually has a point. But at that moment, I couldn't see the point. At that moment, I was not in control. There you are. This means that person at that moment, these two people, the trauma response was speaking to the trauma response. They were both not themselves. Why? Because the amygdala was hyperactive. The hippocampus hasn't worked in the right way, so they don't know how to behave in that specific. And the prefrontal cortex, unfortunately, couldn't really help them regulate very quickly. So they acted in impulse, they acted in temper. So the real essence of these people are really beautiful, really peaceful. But unfortunately, when they got angry with each other, it was trauma speaking to trauma. That's what was happening. At that moment, they were controlled. This is what I meant earlier. We think that we are in control, but in specific situations, we completely lose our control. Now, this is intense environments, but we need to keep in mind it's not necessarily just the intense experiences. Hi, Ankit. Can you please put your Zoom? Hi. All right. Okay, so coming back here, that's trauma communicating to trauma and creating that unnecessary involvement. It's not truly their core essence as human beings. So you're starting to recognize that the impact of trauma. So if you look at these two people and say, oh, they are not spiritual, or they are not expanding, transforming themselves, we are recognized it's not them to be fingers pointed at. It's their trauma, their adversities, the challenges, the traumatic experiences that they experience are to be pointed fingers at, right? So we are recognizing we all have this inner deep self that we can reflect and identify who we truly are, but often our experiences hinder us being able to do this. So now you're recognizing the direct connections between these specific areas of our brain, how they show up in different trauma responses if we compare. So there you are. So you're starting to recognize that now that I have been directly talking about specific brain component connected to reactions, behaviors, reactions, behaviors, thinking, feeling, you're starting to recognize that they are the same places that we earlier looked at. When we looked at meditation, there were specific areas that help us to regulate ourselves, to become more peaceful and to grow. They are the same areas, mostly also controlled by our trauma responses, because neurologically, psychologically, we are also impaired when we go through this kind of difficult experiences. And they are the same areas that we talk about that can be regulated through meditation. So here, as an example, since this is a short session, I only have mentioned few systems that is within our brain. But actually, if you look at the larger picture, you will be able to make more and more connections. You'll be able to connect many more dots, recognizing how the trauma responses, neuroscience, and then meditation as a practice can help us regulate, and also help make us dysregulate as well. So I'd like to say it a bit like this. Trauma is like an invisible shadow whispering in your ear all the time and controlling you the way you feel, controlling the way you behave, controlling the way you react to things without even you realizing. And that's what I meant. When two people are fighting with each other, it truly is the unresolved emotions, the specific way how the brain has learned to react to certain things showing up as a shadow or as an invisible shadow and telling you how to behave, and we lose our control when this is happening. Like I said earlier, this is not only present in the intense moments, but also when we are in a normal regulated environment, also the trauma is sitting next to our ear like an invisible shadow and tell us what to do. So in order for us to talk about more positively, talking about recovering of trauma, the post-traumatic growth, we need to talk about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity literally means our brains, our nervous system's ability to change and adapt. This is what we mean by neuroplasticity. When we talk about neuroplasticity, it is important that we increase the neural networks. We need to reach out to more and more neural networks and let our neural networks recognize, connect the dots, and be able to recognize the connections in a way that we can adopt and change. Now, there are so many ways for us to increase the neuroplasticity. Now you see the abbreviation here, default mode network. Now earlier we talked about sense of self, and then we talk about ego, and now I talk about default mode network. The scientific word for sense of self is default mode network. In other words, if you want to talk about ego in scientific terms, you can call it default mode network. And if default mode network is sense of self, it's important that we increase the neuroplasticity, the adaptability of our brain in a way that we can make more sense of our default mode network. We can make more sense of our sense of self, if not ego. Now, there are many practices that enable this possibility. For example, meditation, Kundalini practices, breath work, and today we discuss psychedelics, and we were discussing about meditation all along this time. So you're starting to recognize, in other words, when you sit down to observe yourself, when you quieten your mind, when you try to remove all the associations and look at yourself, or Vipassana, you're starting to increase the neuroplasticity. That is where the regulation comes in. That is how the different parts of our neural networks in our brain gets activated and start re-regulating ourselves. Now, today we're talking about psychedelics. So I will talk about one of the most common, one of the most safest psychedelics, which is psilocybin, which is commonly known as hallucinogenic mushrooms, if not magic mushrooms. In my opinion, they are called magic mushrooms because there is literally magic. There is literally magic in this universe, and often we don't necessarily are able to process it because we have learned illusions. There's a big difference between illusion and real magic. And I take responsibility to say this, there's real magic in this universe, and there are certain plant that grow just out. This is a fungi, right? Just a fungi that just grows in our natural environment enables us to experience this magic. Now, again, if you ask me, so how do you explain magic in science? Well, the science cannot explain magic. So we have an interesting word to it. We call it mystical experience. In science, we call it mystical experience, and we get around it as if we just understood, as if we know it. It's very much similar when we talk about black holes, antimatter, things like that. We just find a specific, evolution, right? We find a word which kind of bring together the concept of it, and then we come to terms with it. That's human nature. We don't like to be unsettled. We don't like to be in unknown. So the magical experiences these beautiful plant psychedelics enable are called mystical experiences in science. Right, so in psilocybin, there's a very specific substance we call psilocybin. And when you digest it, it breaks into psilocin. And the psilocin molecules are very similar to our serotonin molecules, the neurotransmitters. And the psilocin is able to connect or bond with our neurotransmitters, especially serotonin receptors, perfectly, as if it's made for it. So you see, it's in our nature, it's in our environment, which is psilocybin. If not, magic mushrooms come out of cow dung, rhino dung, elephant dung, or just out of forest, just out of wood. And this specific fungi that is in our ecosystem is able to connect with our brain. It's like our brain has a lock and nature has the key. It's almost like that. It can unlock. When it unlocks, we are able to experience the mystical experience. Right. So earlier we were talking about dissolving attachment. We were talking about ego death or dissolving sense of self. And now we have a new word from science, which is default mode network. Specific regions of our brain come together to form sense of self. Now, when we take psilocybin or psilocin, when it interacts with our body, we are able to dissolve sense of self. Now, this is the connection right here. So these red areas that you see are some of the areas that is responsible for ego dissolution, for your ego default mode network. And then when psilocybin interacts with our brain, it very carefully is able to somehow reduce the function of our default mode network. In other words, what I said about Vipassana earlier, reduce default mode network means dissolving sense of self, dissolving ego. If I'm to use more spiritual word, ego death, right? So there you are. We can meditate through Vipassana over a long period of time and dissolve our sense of self for that minute, for that 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 30 minutes that we have now been able to look at, or we have been able to experience the universe we live in, including ourselves, without association for a second or a few minutes. Just like that, when you take psilocybin, and this is what we call outer body experiences, astral projections, because the reality that you experience during these vibrational practices are completely different from the experiences that we have cognitively right now, as if you are looking at me, you're hearing me, and all of that. All of these things start to change. And this is where also the recreational elements of these psychedelics come to play. Like, for an example, people say, I was able to see sound. I was able to taste color. People say things like that. Let's find out why. The reason is some parts like the PCC, ACC, prefrontal cortex, all of these things are directly affected in a way, in a very safe way during psilocybin induction, if not in taking psilocybin. So that they are directly connected to our subconscious mind or unconscious parts of our brain, like amygdala and hippocampus, and they're able to impact each other. Although, for an example, amygdala and hippocampus are not part of our default mode network. These parts continue to function during an experience, during a psilocybin induction, for an example. However, they are able to directly impact these different components that are not connected. Most of the time, our outer layer of the brain, if not the default mode network, the sense of self is controlling everything, always weighing around before we do something, react, or we react without deciding because of the control that it is holding. And what really happens during psilocybin induction or any other most psychedelic induction is that the different cortexes responsible for an example, language, remembering words, remembering grammar, taste, the smell, the languages, the balance, the colors, these things usually need to have a complex network that needs to go through default mode network to make sense. But what happens during psilocybin experience, for an example, these cortexes are able to connect with each other like never ever before for the very first time. In other words, more and more new neural networks are activated in your brain under psilocybin. Now, if you look at this example, infographic representation of MRI, neuroimaging, this A diagram is the sober brain, if not the brain that is placebo. There is no anything in it. But the B brain representation actually is the psilocybin inducted brain, while we have psilocin connecting with our receptors in our body. Now, if you notice the different colors around it, just like what you see here, these different colors represent different cortexes responsible for different things. In a normal situation like the diagram A, they connect very little, but during B, it's able to connect much wider, like several hundred times more than the normal brain. So I'm starting to recognize that it's almost like fast track. It's almost like quickly being able to build those neural networks in our brain, make much larger connections. The larger connections means larger awareness. Larger awareness would mean directly increasing the capacity of our brain. The moment we are able to make more connections, that means we have activated new neural paths, new neural networks in a way that we are able to somehow strengthen those new awareness into ourselves as an integrated possibility. So now if I bring back everything that I have been discussing so far. So we looked at earlier the meditation, and we saw that there are specific parts of our brain that are directly impacted by meditation. And then we looked at some of the neuroscience aspects of trauma and the trauma responses, and we recognize some of those components are directly connected with the same areas of our brain similar to the meditation areas. And now we are looking at the psilocybin experience, and we are starting to recognize those are very much the similar areas. Although here I'm only indicating just a few of them. If you look at it in the larger picture, many of the areas that is impacted during a psilocybin experience are also directly connected to the areas that regulate meditation, that is dysregulated by the traumatic experiences and responsible for trauma responses or PTSD or CPTSD. So then you're starting to recognize that whether we call it spiritual path, whether we call it coaching, whether we call it therapy, whether we call it psilocybin integration, whether we call it maybe meditation or Kundalini practice or breath work, what we are really trying to do is truly impact those specific areas of our brain so that we are able to re-regulate ourselves and create new neural networks, increase the neuroplasticity, the adaptability of our brain, and then enable our expansion, enable our growth. How does that work? So when we are able to increase the neural networks, as much as you are gaining higher vision, higher understanding, higher awareness, it's also possible for an integration practitioner to help you break down those surreal experiences, very abstract and symbolic experiences, and start creating meaning. So meaning making. We are able to create new meaning making mechanisms while literally healing our brain during a psilocybin experience. And that is why, if you look at the research from Johns Hopkins, that we recognize that people who undergo this experience, just like 11 therapy sessions, one psilocybin experience, thanks to 1.5 grams of dried mushrooms, able to bring people out of their depression, fully remission, about 50% of them. And then people who have been diagnosed with cancer, which is anxiety in this case, are able to decrease a large percentage, almost like average of 70% of them come out of that anxiety, come to terms with their illness, their difficulties, challenges, and even death. And on top of all of that, now we are talking about people who are experiencing challenges. But how about healthy individuals? Over about 90% of the people who go through these experiences mention that it actually changes themselves on a more wider perspective, enabling them to have more peace within themselves and also create peace within their people around them as well. So how I would like to talk about this is a common way of addressing this in the scientific community is like, if our brain was a snow mountain, we usually stick to those initial paths that we create through walking or sleds. And then our brain is kind of like a lazy machine. It likes to stick to those same paths. And this is what we call conditioning. This is what we call trauma responses. We are always using the same neural paths to operate, react in a specific way. We don't explore any further. But think about this hyper-connected state, which you saw earlier, like the new snowfall, where you are able to make more meaning. You are able to look at the bigger picture and regulate certain areas and stick to new parts and get rid of the older parts. So that's one of the best ways that we can explain. So now coming back, starting to recognize, if you look at things from a neuroscience perspective, just our brain has specific areas that are not just only exclusive towards our development or just towards our spiritual journey. It's actually an interconnected play between the traumatic experiences, challenges, adversities, cultural conditioning, societal conditioning, political conditioning, all of that is happening to us. And when we talk about Buddhism as a philosophy, we are talking about thousands of years ago, a practitioner who is able to observe themselves and recognize, without knowing enough neuroscience or science to begin with, recognizing that getting into a specific practice of observing ourselves on a long-term basis, we are able to create this vibrational change within ourselves, directly impacting certain areas of our brain. So this is the power of transformation, when we are able to combine all of these different elements and look at the integrated possibilities, look at the holistic possibilities, without just only dressing up in a specific way and following a specific ritual to spiritually develop, or just only focusing on science, or depending on symptomatic management like medicine, or just only conventional therapy or coaching. When we're able to open our mind and look into scientifically safe, scientifically studied practices like psychedelic integration, not just only consuming mushroom, but also enabling you to experience this powerful connection by preparing through a process, through a specific psychological, deep reflective process, therapeutic process, and then after the experiencing, continuing to integrate it with a qualified practitioner enables you to not just only um, heal yourself in a way or understand the bigger picture. The moment you do that, when you heal your trauma, when you heal your inner child, when you heal, or when you rise up from your adversities, you're starting to recognize that you are actually able to also continue a spiritual journey of development. So lastly, I would like to share with you late Professor Roland Griffiths, sharing from Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness Research. He says, I have come to think of meditation and psilocybin have been complementary processes for investigation of the nature of mind. And in fact, neuroimaging studies show that they both produce similar changes in the brain regions related to the sense of self. And this is what I have been trying to explain all this time during this entire session, that the areas that affect trauma, areas that affect ours, that create spirituality, creates development, expansion in our mind, are all interlinked. They're all the same places that we are talking about. And he also continues to say, well, if meditation represents the true cause of the investigation of the mind, psilocybin surely represents the crash course. In other words, it literally means that when professional meditators who have been meditating for 25 to 30 years undergo psilocybin experiences, and then they have their minds blown and they say, I've never been able to experience of something that powerful going through just the meditation. So it's complementary. They all come together in order for us to succeed, in order for us to develop and experience the sacredness within us without just only connecting with the associations and always being so deeply misled and living in an illusion of problems, day-to-day world problems that we are so stuck up with. And it's not just only connected to seeing the bigger picture, but when we are able to clarify the lack within ourselves, clarify the illusion within ourselves, it opens up new doors to abundance. And this would also mean money, this would mean comfort, this would mean materialism, this would mean sex. This would at the same time also mean being able to live between these two paradoxical, the nature of reality, which is the pain and the pleasure. This is what I also meant by love without attachment. You can love things, you can also experience difficulties, adversities, but you're not necessarily attached to it. You're starting to see things from the consciousness perspective. Who am I really? The deeper you ask, the more and more it surfaces that I am just consciousness. I am observing love, I'm observing pain and hate and fear. So the more you are able to gain that level, this doesn't necessarily require you to dissolve your ego all the time. It's impossible. Dissolving ego literally at all times means that your default mode network is not functional. That means you are in a vegetative state. If not, you are in a state that any harm can easily happen to you. But true ego dissolution from Buddhist philosophy or from a Vipassana meditation perspective is that ability to disengage, disassociate from our associations for a short period of time and experience the oneness, experience the emptiness, experience everything and nothing at the same time in a way that you rise from that experience to understand the bigger reality of pain and pleasure and disengage from all of that and being able to live a more healthier life, more healed life, more spiritual life. So I would say spirituality is not about dressing up in a specific way, speaking in a specific way, belong to a specific group, or following a specific ritual. Spirituality truly means being able to love everything, acknowledge everything, but not necessarily be attached to them and live your life to the best. Is it that what money that you want to engage with and create that love without attachment? go for it. Is it abundance, materialism? Is it sex? Is it something else? Is it arts? So we are able to embrace everything. As much as we will embrace money, we will also be able to embrace the other side of the truth, which is that life can be painful. So as we embrace money, we will embrace pain. As we embrace pain, we will embrace pleasure in a way that we are non-attached. They do not necessarily make a large impact within yourself. In other words, what we mean here is that we don't react to pain or pleasure strongly. We are able to derive awareness from pain and pleasure and live our life the way we want it. And for that, we don't have to have necessarily a uniform. We don't necessarily need to be spiritual. We don't need to have a uniform. To be spiritual, we don't necessarily need to have a specific group of people or a specific chanting or specific ritualistic practice. We can also embrace them if that's what you like. There is no, in other words, necessarily right way or wrong way of doing things. When we look at things from a holistic, integrated perspective and embracing all possibilities within the universe that we live in. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for staying with me and enabling me to share this with you. So if you have any insights, you're most welcome. All right, so I see that you are in a very, very deep reflective process, which is great. I invite you to continue to reflect, and I realize that I have taken 10 minutes extra of your time. So I look forward to stay in touch. If you have any insight, questions, feel free to send me, you know how to find me. So look forward to keeping in touch. Bye for now. I wish you a wonderful rest of the week ahead. Thank you.